This is part two commentary on the book titled Who Wrote the Bible by Dr. Richard Elliott Friedman. In part one, we discussed some of the biblical contradictions which over the centuries led many religious figures to doubting that Moses was the author of the first 5 books in the Bible, right? The Pentateuch. And so in part two, we're going to be discussing the current understanding of how the Bible was put together and the multiple hands that played a part in putting it together, right? And so one thing that I want to stress before we start is that these videos are for critically thinking people who have genuine questions and concerns about the Bible and really want to know what it's about from a different point of view other than a religious perspective, right? These videos are not to try to convince or to convert anyone from their belief, right? Because that's just a waste of time, right? And in fact, the intent is to discourage as much as possible fervent and zealous believers from even watching these videos, right? Because there's really nothing here for people who are inquiring in that type of with that type of approach, right? There's a big difference between critically examining and questioning the Bible and just opening it up and just believing everything that's there on the page, and right, and bowing down in submission to the words, right? There's two completely different things, right? Two different approaches. And there's a place for both, right? And so if someone is curious and they want answers to the hard questions about the Bible, then this is the right place, right? But if someone wants to just believe and just do this and just in submission, right, then there's other places for that, right? There's other audiences. That's a different type of audience. And there's no shortage of places on YouTube and on the internet of people that cater to that type of approach, right? There's nothing wrong with it. It's just that that's not what's happening here, right? We're going to critically examine. And then if later on, if we want to get into some other types of interpretations, then we're open for that. And so when we critically examine the biblical text, you can't help but to run into the pattern where stories seem to repeat themselves, right? For example, in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, the authors describe the creation process twice. And so in Genesis 1:27, we see that God makes male and female together, right? And then in Genesis 2:7, it describes a completely different account where it creates the man first, and then later in the chapter, the woman is created. And so the thinking person may see this and question, why is it written like this, right? And if they have reached a certain level of a consciousness to receive the answer, they will understand that these are two different accounts of which biblical scholars call doublets, right? These are not two complementary stories of creation where one story is explaining or giving more detail to the other. These are two separate stories interwoven together, right? Other familiar doublets are like the covenant between Abraham and God in Genesis 12 and in Genesis 17. The flood story with Noah, that's a doublet too, right? And many other stories which may shock a lot of people, right? And we'll go over many of these between this series and in the commentary on the book, The Composition of the Pentateuch by Professor Joel Baden, right? So make sure to watch both of those series so we can get some understanding.
Those who defended the traditional belief in Mosaic authorship argued that the doublets were always complementary, not repetitive, and that they did not contradict each other, but came to teach us a lesson by their apparent contradiction.
Right, and so the people who were just not ready to let go of the incorrect idea that Moses authored the first 5 books tried to make it seem as if there were no contradictions, but rather they just looked like contradictions, right? To teach people a lesson, right? Remember, we talked about it before, how they used the midrashic method, right? Of creating these outside narratives to try to fix many of these textual problems, right? And you have people like Rabbi Rashi who were especially skillful at doing this. And you still have people today who were especially skillful at doing the same thing, right? When I found out that myself and also everyone else in the Israelites and other Christian communities were also especially skillful at creating these other outside narratives to fix many of these problems and contradictions, that's when I realized, the Bible has a problem, right? People are creating their own narratives and they're making the Bible say what they want it to say, right? And it's not an absolute truth, right? It's more of a personal revelation, right? Which is fine, but that could be completely different from what the authors of the Bible intended it to mean.
But another clue was discovered that undermined this traditional response. Investigators found that in most cases, one of the two versions of a doublet story would refer to the deity by the divine name Yahweh, formerly mispronounced Jehovah, and the other version of the story would refer to the deity simply as God. That is, the doublets lined up into two groups of parallel versions of stories. Each group was almost always consistent about the name of the deity that it used. Moreover, the investigators found that it was not only the names of the deity that lined up, they found various other terms and characteristics that regularly appeared in one or the other group. This tended to support the hypothesis that someone had taken two different old source documents, cut them up, and woven them together to form the continuous story in the 5 books of Moses.
Right, go and open the Bible and look in Genesis 1, and you'll see the name God, or the Hebrew name Elohim, being used there. And when you go over to the next chapter, starting at verse 4, you'll see the name the Lord God, or Yahweh Elohim in Hebrew, right? And have you ever wondered why that's the case? And why they are telling two different creation stories and using these two different names? The reason is there are multiple authors with multiple different names for who they imagine to be God, right? In this particular point in the story, right? And so in Genesis 2 verse 3, that's the end of the creation story for the first author. And in Genesis 2 verse 4, that's the beginning for the other author, right? And then there's someone who scholars call a redactor or an editor who is weaving these two accounts together skillfully to create what on the surface looks like a continuous story.
And so the next stage of the investigation was the process of separating the strands of the two old source documents. In the 18th century, 3 independent investigators arrived at similar conclusions based on such studies. A German minister, H.B. Witter, a French medical doctor, John Astruc, and a German professor, J.G. Eichhorn. At first, it was thought that one of the two versions of the stories in the book of Genesis was an ancient text that Moses used as a source, and that the other version of the stories was Moses' own writing, describing these things in his own words. Later, it was thought that both versions of the stories were old source documents that Moses had used in fashioning his work. But ultimately, it was concluded that both of the two sources had to be from writers who lived after Moses. Each step of the process was attributing less and less to Moses himself.
Right. What's important to understand is that these 3 investigators were all religious figures. H.B. Witter being a minister, John Astruc was at first a Protestant minister, then converted to Catholicism, and then J.G. Eichhorn was a Protestant theologian. Right. They were not trying to disprove the Bible. Right. They were trying to provide clarity on why the text read the way it did. And so they concluded that there must be separate documents spliced together. And at first, they and others tried their absolute best to try to find a way to keep Moses as being the author of these books. But as they kept investigating and looking at the evidence, they finally had to throw their hands up, right, surrender, and conclude that, hey, these texts were written by people after Moses, right? Moses was becoming a distant and shadowy figure in regards to the involvement of writing these biblical texts. And so the continuation of this two-source hypothesis continued into the 1900s. But all of a sudden, investigators came across another discovery. Now here's what happened and what they found out.
Scholars found evidence that there were not 2 major source documents in the Pentateuch after all. There were 4. 2 scholars found that in the first 4 books of the Bible, there were not only doublets, but a number of triplets of stories.
They found out that there were not just 2 independent sources which make up the first 5 books of the Bible, but instead there were 4, right? And not only were there 2 versions of the same story, known as doublets, but in some instances, they found that there were 3 versions of that same story, and they called those triplets. What is an example of a triplet, one may ask? That's a great question. And the answer is you can find a triplet in the holy days given in Leviticus 23, Numbers 28 through 29, and in Deuteronomy 16, right? There's 3 different accounts given on the holy days.
This converged with other evidence involving contradictions in characteristic language that persuaded them that they had found another source within the Pentateuch. And then a young German scholar, W.M.L. DeWitt, observed in his doctoral dissertation that the fifth of the 5 books of Moses, the book of Deuteronomy, was strikingly different in its language from the 4 books that preceded it. None of the 3 old source documents appear to continue into this book.
D. Wett was a biblical scholar and also a theologian, not an atheist or anyone outside of the Christian circle, right? And he was the one who discovered that the book of Deuteronomy was linguistically different from the other books before it in the Hebrew Bible, right? And that's something to think about. And then from this discovery, he concluded that Deuteronomy must have come from a different source other than those in the preceding books, right? And so eventually there was enough awareness where those who had the knowledge could open up the Bible and see right before their very eyes the works of at least 4 different sources, in which we will also be able to see at the end of the commentary in this series and at the end of the commentary on the series, The Composition of the Pentateuch. So if you want your eyes to be aware of this type of knowledge, then continue in this series. But if not, then I would advise you to stop now, because there's certain knowledge that people are just not ready for, right? But the good thing is that you can always come back at a later time if you happen to find yourself ready at a later stage. And so let's get a little bit more information about these 4 sources in what is called the documentary hypothesis. And so the sources are broken down into 4 letters, J, E, P, and D. The J source stands for Javist or Yahweh, because this source primarily refers to the deity by this name. And it's Javist because this is how the Germans pronounce it, and they were the ones who made this discovery. And then you have the E source, which refers to the deity as Elohim, right? And so it's given the letter E. And then you have the P source, which is concerned largely with the legal and priestly matters, and therefore they gave it the letter P. And then you have the D source, which is found only in the book of Deuteronomy, right? And it's represented by the letter D. And so after these documents were found, the investigators were left with many questions to be answered, right? This was just the beginning. So let's go ahead and get some more.
The question was to uncover the history of these 4 documents. Not only who wrote them, but why 4 different versions of the story were written, what their relationship to each other was, whether any of the authors were aware of the existence of the other's text, when in history each was produced, how they were preserved and combined, and a host of other questions.
Now notice the questions being asked, right? If we don't ask questions, then we don't get answers, right? One of the reasons why humans are able to get on an airplane and then fly to another destination is because some people asked how that could be done, right? And then they went and searched for the answers to that question or those questions, and then they brought those answers from the mental world down into the physical world of existence, right? And now we experience the fruits of that process. And so what we're seeing here is that the questioning process is an ongoing process, right? It never stops.
The first was to try to determine the relative order in which they were written. The idea was to try to see if each version reflected a particular stage in the development of religion in biblical Israel. This approach reflected the influence in 19th century Germany of Hegelian notions of historical development of civilization. 2 19th century figures stand out. They approached the problem in very different ways, but they arrived at complementary findings. One of them, Karl Heinrich Graf, worked on deducing from references in the various biblical texts which of the texts logically must have preceded or followed others. The other investigator, Wilhelm Vatke, sought to trace the history of the development of ancient Israelite religion by examining texts for clues as to whether they reflected early or late stages of the religion.
Graf and Vatke were 2 German Protestant biblical scholars who were tackling the question on the order of the biblical sources, right? And so Graf understood the J and the E sources to be the earliest, right? With D coming after, because D is showing that it is acquainted with later developments in history. And he believed that the P source was the latest of all of them because the P source was dealing with matters which none of the 3 sources seemed to be familiar with. And so you have Vatke, who also thought that the J and E sources were the earliest, but that they reflected a time when Israel was in a nature fertility stage, right? And he thought D came afterwards during Israel's ethical and spiritual stage. And then he concluded that P came last during a time where the concern centered around the priest, the offering, sacrifices, and the law, right? And so this is what they concluded based off of their knowledge, right? And off of their research, right? And then afterwards, you have a German scholar named Julius Wellhausen, who took all the information that we discussed and a whole bunch more, right? And he organized it and he made it comprehensible, right? And so Dr. Richard Elliott Friedman says this.
His presentation was sensible, articulate, and extremely influential. His was a powerful construction, above all because it did more than just divide the sources by the usual criteria, doublets, contradiction, etc. It tied the source documents to history. It provided a believable framework in which they could have developed. Thus, the Wellhausen model began to answer the question of why the different sources existed. The first real acceptance of this field of study, then, came when historical and literary analysis were first successfully merged. This model of the combination of the source documents came to be known as the documentary hypothesis. It has dominated the field ever since. To this day, if you want to disagree, you disagree with Wellhausen. If you want to pose a new model, you compare its merits with those of Wellhausen's model.
And so it stands, according to Dr. Richard Elliott Friedman, that the documentary hypothesis is the dominant model, right? And if somebody wants to disagree with it, then they have to create a new model which adequately explains the biblical contradictions, the linguistic differences in the text, and also the choppy, disconnected narratives in the stories, right? And they can't just say because God or Jesus did it, right? We don't live in that age anymore, right? Where the religious institutions could just get away with doing that. And the people only had the option of just accepting it as the definitive answer, right? Not today. And so religious opposition to the outside biblical explanation was still a thing in the 1800s, as Dr. Richard Elliott Friedman says. And he talks about two figures who tried to bring this information to the forefront. And let's see what happened as a result.
The documentary hypothesis became known in English-speaking countries in large part because of the work of William Robertson Smith, a professor of Old Testament in the Free Church of Scotland College at Aberdeen and editor of the Encyclopedia Britannica. He wrote articles in the encyclopedia and published articles by Wellhausen there as well. He was put on trial before the church. Though he was cleared of the charge of heresy, he was expelled from his chair. Also in the 19th century, in South Africa, John Colenso, an Anglican bishop, published similar conclusions, and within 20 years, 300 responses were written. He was called the Wicked Bishop.
In the 1800s, when William Robertson Smith published his article in the encyclopedia showing that the Bible had multiple authors, which didn't include Moses, he was expelled from his position, right? And when the Bishop John Colenso published these same conclusions, then the religious zealots wrote 300 responses, and they called him the Wicked Bishop, right? People still do this today if people bring out information that shakes their beliefs, right? And the reason that they do this is because they're operating from a perspective that is based solely on faith, right? It doesn't value facts in this area, right? And one thing that we must understand is that people have to actually value the facts for the facts to be of worth to them, right? Or else you're just simply wasting your time when you're having these type of discussions with people who don't value that type of information.
Until the past generation, there were Orthodox Christian and Jewish scholars who contested the documentary hypothesis in scholarly circles. At present, however, there is hardly a biblical scholar in the world actively working on the problem who would claim that the 5 books of Moses were written by Moses or by any one person. Scholars argue about the number of different authors who wrote any given biblical book. They argue about when the various documents were written and about whether a particular verse belongs to this or that document. They express varying degrees of satisfaction or dissatisfaction with the usefulness of the hypothesis for literary or historical purposes. But the hypothesis itself continues to be the starting point of research. No serious student of the Bible can fail to study it, and no other explanation of the evidence has come close to challenging it.
Right, and like Dr. Richard Elliott Friedman says, almost no biblical scholar working on the problem would say that Moses or just any one author wrote the 5 books, right? The evidence just doesn't support that. But there are disagreements on the number of issues related to the documentary hypothesis, such as which particular verses belong to J, E, P, or D, right? But the documentary hypothesis still provides the best explanation at this time as to why the biblical text is the way it is, right? And he says that no serious student of the Bible can skip over this hypothesis, right? And this is why they teach this in the leading universities, right? They teach it in Yale, Harvard, Princeton, right? And many other leading institutions, right? This is what they teach and the information that those students come out with, right? And many of them graduate from these schools and they follow the words of Abraham ibn Ezra, right? And they keep their mouths closed, right? And they don't say a word about none of this stuff, right? And they just keep people doing this, just bowing down, right? And handing over the money, right? And on one hand, I don't really blame them because this is what people want, right? So in a sense, people get exactly what they ask for. That's just the way it goes, right? So this is the end of part 2 commentary on Who Wrote the Bible by Dr. Richard Elliott Freeman. Stay tuned for part 3 because we're going to be going back in time to learn about the world that produced this biblical masterpiece known as the Bible, right? And so I want to thank you for watching to the end. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you on part 3.